name is Patrick Ryan. I'm going to be doing a presentation on prototyping, and yeah, we'll get started. So, quick about me: I'm a senior engineer by trade. I work at Skymap Games up in New Hampshire, the Manchester area. I've worked there for about 8 years between contract and full time. Worked on some cool launch titles for various platforms. I worked on Guildlings for Apple Arcade. Worked on JETT the Far Shore for PlayStation 5. Also done some cool ports. I worked on Real Miss Masterpiece Edition for the Switch, as well as Republic Anniversary Edition for the Switch and PlayStation. And yeah, been a really fun time up there. I'm a designer by necessity. Working solo, you kind of gotta do a lot there. So I released my own personal project Schlocks on Steam. It was a VR multiplayer pass and play sort of kind of WarioWare-esque game. No longer available, but if you want to try it, I can give you a copy. And then I'm a project manager by desperation because working on solo projects, I've realized that there's a lot more managerial stuff that you need to do than kind of is in my wheelhouse. So you got to get through it. And then brief aside, seems irrelevant, but important to this talk. In high school, wanted to be a chef. My high school worked with a local tech school to do specialty classes for juniors and seniors. Instead of doing computer science to kind of give me a jump start to where I am now, I chose to go into culinary arts, which is not a real skill that I use too much right now. But in this presentation, I'm also going to teach you some things I learned 15 years ago in culinary arts. So, what to expect in this talk? First thing, learn about prototyping. Like many people, I find myself in an abundance of ideas. However, time is valuable. Working full time and then finding time, nights and weekends to work on your own stuff is tough. And kind of figuring out what idea is worth pursuing is definitely, a challenge of it itself. So instead of investing a lot of time in one idea, I think it's better to, spend your early time on many ideas, a little less time on many ideas. Second, learn about culinary arts. This could be something that you find important. Maybe you learn something you can bring home what you're cooking tonight, or what you learned about for some friends or anything like that. And then last thing is to get inspired to make things. I want more people to make more things. That's kind of always my goal when I talk to anyone, is to encourage people to make stuff, whether it's good, whether it's fun, whether it's bad. I think anything you make is great. And last thing, if there's time at the end, I'll just go over an example of a prototype that I made, running through some of these topics that I talk about, allowing me to kind of work through some of my thought process out loud. Second is why prototyping. As I said, many ideas, little time. Prototyping in and of itself is a skill that you can get better at. It is something that you can work on and find yourself getting faster and more efficient at prototyping. Because this is something that you'll use both in your personal life as well in your professional life. I find that prototyping is not the most valuable thing out of this talk. It's actually getting to the iteration part of the idea that is the most important part. And this helps both in your personal life, on your personal projects, as well as at work. When you have idea holders that come up to you and say, "Hey, I have this idea for this mechanic or this feature," getting that back into their hands is where the valuable part comes in, because their idea might be great and they can tweak it, or you might prove that their idea is bad and they're going to scrap it. The faster that you kind of get to that iteration part, the faster that you can realize what needs to change to go forth. Your idea is never perfect the first time that you implement it. So the iteration part is actually sort of where this kind of quickly gets to, is, hey, how do we get there faster? Because I want to spend my most time on the thing that everyone actually wants. So if the idea holder says, "Ooh, that's not too bad," I'd rather waste a little time getting a prototype done quickly versus investing a lot of time and then kind of at the tail end the idea holder says, that's not too important. So I'm talking about scale here. This is kind of my idea of how the idea process works, from idea to full production. You have your idea, everyone's got them, it's a lot of them, they're free. Next up is proof of concept. This is the most bare bones things that you can put together. This is going to have just the core features that you need to get in the game, run around, jump, click, whatever. then followed by that is the prototype. This is a little bit more feature complete. This actually shows off what your idea is a little bit more than just the kind of core mechanics required to even function in the game. Then you move to vertical slice, which is a full feature complete idea saying, hey, I've touched every system. I can now demonstrate full loops. I can now demonstrate all the meta systems and outside systems like that. And then you move to full production, which is a whole other beast. So this talk is going to focus mostly on from idea to prototype, and then everything after that is you're on your own. All right, now we get into culinary arts terms. First, I'm going to teach you mise en place. This is the French term for everything in its place. Also means gathering, depending on who you ask. Essentially is the time in cooking where you make sure to get all of your ingredients together in a nice, easy to access place. This is very helpful for prototyping, because when I started prototyping, I took an idea, opened up an engine, started going, and found those to be much more messier than if I actually take the time up front to mise en place, to do some design, to do some organization. And then, as I said, take some time to design up front here. The efficiency of prototyping goes up when there's an initial investment. It really allows you to kind of be in the flow for much, much longer. Because I feel that, these prototypes, even though they're pretty simple ideas, the more time that you have to step away and kind of break down what you're working on and kind of figure out what's next, you kind of lose your flow. All right, next up, we're getting to the cuts. So the first cut, you're going to cut a wide swath. This is the Julian cut. This is kind of the most basic cut that you learn. It's 1/8 inch by 1/8 inch by 1 to 2 inches. This is great for stir-fried noodle dishes. It's also still thick enough that has some crunch to it, so it's good in like raw salads. And it also cooks very fast. So the first thing is we're going to do a big destructive cut to cut your idea down to size. We're going to really isolate what you're trying to show as the hook or the idea or the thing that you really want to say, hey, this is my concept. Prototype should be small, but the proof of concept phase where you're kind of cutting all this stuff out is going to be even smaller. So you might take time here to think about what is the fun, what is the grab, and allow you to kind of differentiate yourself between other similar titles. And then keep boiling it down until you get to that kind of core idea, because that's where you're going to start with your prototype. All right, briefly talk about cook times. So cook times, different ingredients take different times. If you ever realize that when you are cooking, some things come overdone pretty quickly, or you end up with things underdone, you have to understand that different types of food, different ingredients take different cook times as you're cooking a meal. The core is the largest cook. This is going to be the thing that is kind of, might not even be your idea, but the kind of core mechanic of the game that even needs to function. So if you're making a 3D platformer, this is going to be your character controller. Maybe that's not your hook. Maybe your hook is some other element of your game, but you're still going to need that character controller to run around, jump, and interact with everything else that you're going to put into your title. Next is your additives. These are your mediums. This is the layer that makes your idea your idea. So this is when you turn to focus from, hey, I'm making a 3D platformer, got a character controller, jump, to, hey, this 3D platformer uses a wrench, and that's the mechanic, and I'm going to make this wrench interact with nuts and bolts and things in the environment. And then the last thing is the finishes. This is the low cook time. So this is for any more specifics that you might find as you go, anything more niche, things that are easy to kind of do at the tail end. Next cut it out, brunoise. This is a julienne that you cut even smaller. It is 1/8 by 1/8 by 1/8. It's a very small cook. This is for fine dining, for garnishes, also good in salads. And this is the juice. At the moment when you start a prototype, you got to cut out the juice. I know juice and feel is very important to demonstrate your title, but at the start here, it can be really distracting. It's really easy to kind of fall down the rabbit hole of, hey, I have this cool animation, or hey, I'm going to add these cool particle effects, but it is a little distracting for you to kind of get your idea into a place where you can show it off. So we're going to cut that out, and we're going to focus just on the mechanics. Next cut, the chop. simple chop here, cut expectations. These are non-uniform, but roughly the same size. These are good for blended soups, roasting vegetables, and this is where you should make sure to understand that this is not going to be perfect. It's prototype, it's proof of concept. You need to understand that you have a vision in your idea. You have an idea in your head, a vision of what you see as this idea. Touch the wire, my bad.
Sat on a chair.
Yeah. You have a vision, you see it, but you got to make sure that, hey, you're going to understand going into a prototype that you're not going to get that idea. So it's better to go low. Low expectations means things you make, you'll impress yourself with. You'll be able to understand that for everyone else. Next cut, we're going to cut corners. This is the dice. This is a chop, but it's uniform. You want to make sure that they are all the exact same size. You want to square up your veggies. This is when you want consistency. So you want consistency, texture, and visual throughout your meal or out your salad, and they all have the same cook time. So even if you have a great idea, you want to use as much placeholders as you can. You want to get to the point where you're iterating and experimenting. So that means, for things that you start out with, you need to, use placeholders, use assets, use templates, whatever you need to kind of cut out any of the extra time you'd spend on visuals to get down to the mechanics. Next up, we're going to cut and paste the chiffonade. This is for rolled greens. You roll up greens, good for herb salads and garnishes. So this is another irregular cut because you're just rolling up your greens and cutting them into kind of thin strips. So this is kind of more important once you start going through multiple prototypes. As you develop and continue prototyping, it's good to reuse concepts or ideas or mechanics or code from your previous projects. This will really help speed up your prototyping and your personal projects. So every time you kind of finish a prototype, take time to evaluate what you worked on, kind of identify core mechanics or features that you say, hey, this could be reused. Might not be the same idea, but this core feature of this sort of manager or this sort of level loader. Take those ideas, put them in a project that's separate, allowing you to kind of easily access all of your kind of tools that you've built over the course of that prototype to reuse in your next prototype. Because once again, we're trying to speed this up. We want to get faster and better. You're not going to reach rapid prototyping until you've done regular prototyping. Because you need to have those skills and those tools that kind of speed things up. And you realize that you kind of write a lot of the same code a lot, allowing you to kind of take that from a previous project to your new project and kind of jumpstart your next cook. All right, next up is the baton. Cut in. This is when we are going to, this is like a julienne, but it's thicker. It's 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, and it's 2 to 3 inches in length. This is great for, raw finger foods, dipping vegetables, as well as French fries. If you ever cut potatoes, this is the kind of desired size of a home fry. So this is when you want to start building up your. This is when you want to start building up your idea. Kind of up until this point, we've hit proof of concept, and now we're kind of moving on to the prototyping, or the prototype phase of kind of this idea here. This is when you want to add your layers, you want to add your additives. You want to start thinking, hey, we've cut corners, we've cut and pasted all of these kind of core features of our prototype. And now we want to kind of cut in some new ideas here. This is when you start saying, hey, I have my basics. What makes this game my game? What makes this idea stand out? What makes it, my sort of flavor on this sort of style of game? So this is when we start adding in those additives. We get a little thicker here. And finally, cut loose. This is the paysan cut. This is a similar cut, but it could be more of a natural shape. The julienne and the baton are squared off vegetables, but the paysan doesn't have to be, it could be carrot shaped. It could be, your celery, you'll cut like this. These are, roughly, ½ inch by ½ inch by 1/4 if you're cutting it square. But as I said, they can be natural sizes. So, this could, once again, be used for, thinly sliced vegetables for roasting as well as salads. And this is actually where we're going to, use this at the tail end of the cycle. You've gotten your proof of concept, you've moved to your prototype. Now you're going to start adding a little juice back to your idea here. So if you have any time left, ideally your prototyping is kind of time based. You're saying, hey, I'm going to spend a week on this, 2 weeks, a month, kind of whatever time you have left. Make sure to use that time to add a little juice. It is kind of easy to think that the juice isn't important. I myself, when I started programming, I was a little bit of a purist. I said, oh, the only thing that matters is code and mechanics. And then every time I added a sound effect or a visual aspect of the game, it always got better. At this point in time, I know how important and valuable all of that is for a prototype. Even to get your idea across, it is kind of easy for players to kind of get caught up in some of the lack of that feel. So anytime you have some extra time, make sure to add some sound effects, add a little visual, take the time to kind of say, hey, we cut this all out earlier. Now I have a little extra time. Let's add some garnishes. Let's add some finishes. Next up, you're going to cut yourself some slack. This is a mince. This is like a dice or chop, but very small. It's the smallest cut you're going to do. This is great for, to have something, the flavor kind of be out throughout your dish, because it's going to be so small, it's going to mix in very well. Your garlic is going to be the thing you mince the most, throughout your life, but you can mince any other vegetables to kind of spread them throughout. And so at this point, you've gone through your prototype, you've cut your expectations, but you still need to cut yourself some slack at the end, because even if your expectations maybe were too high, understand that, hey, you went through it, didn't go exactly as planned, or the final version wasn't even what you thought when you started this prototype, but it is still great to have this project that you worked on all the way through. So don't get caught up on any of the remaining placeholders that you left in that you didn't have time for, or the aesthetics or the feel. Because at this point, kind of wrapped up the bow of what you want to work on. So some parts of the prototype you'll just kind of have to settle and accept is kind of not even where you thought it was at the beginning of beginning of the idea. Now, cut your losses. This is shred. This is for non-rolled greens, grate and stir fry. You can use a knife or mandolin for a slice. At any point in the process, if you don't think things are shaping up the way you want them to, or you're not having fun, just sort of drop it. This is a fun project, and if you're not having fun, I don't think the idea is turning out the way that you want. But it is still important that even when you kind of end a project that you didn't finish or get to a point where you showed off to anyone else, take your time to evaluate it, as I said earlier, to kind of find those bits of pieces that you can reuse for your other, future prototypes. Because you'll still find good code in that project that you kind of discarded as you weren't, too happy with the way it was going. On the other end, if you didn't cut your losses, it's time to eat and share. So celebrate. Making something is great, no matter what it is. Didn't exist beforehand. Now it exists. That's a fantastic feeling. So time to show it off. Time to reach out to your friends and family and say, hey, I made this thing. I would love for you to test this out. And then, as I said, we're at the point where iteration is kind of the most important thing here. So as you show it off, make sure to ask for constructive feedback. Make sure to ask for their thoughts and their feelings of what you made, because the best way that your idea is going to turn into what you wanted in the first place is this iteration part, because you'll find out that, hey, my idea wasn't necessarily exactly perfect on the first go, and so that is the kind of end goal of these prototypings, is to spend some extra time kind of iterating over what you've worked on. And then after that, start another. I think that prototyping is great when you do it in batches. Take 3 or 4 ideas, run through 3 or 4 prototypes, and then you can kind of evaluate, hey, out of these 3 or 4 ideas, which one is actually kind of worth me pursuing even further. It allows you kind of shake out a lot of that kind of extra design that you might have as you're working through prototypes. You start thinking about other ideas and other flavors, and so you can kind of shake that all out, work on 3 or 4 prototypes, and then say, hey, this one was actually the most fun. It had the best reception. My friends and family really loved it. Now let's kind of like work on this a little bit more and see if we can get this anywhere, because those iterations of all of those prototypes are going to make whatever final project you have even better. And so that's the end of the slides. I'll go through. We got some time here. We got a few more minutes, so I'll go through an example of a project that prototype that I worked on, and kind of work through some some ideas. Let me just switch my. Hopefully, this doesn't break too much. All right. So just an example. So I worked on a prototype. It's a pachinko roguelike. So taking the idea of pachinko machines, very popular over in Japan, and kind of how would I add roguelike elements to a pachinko machine. So this is the first build that I got up, and I'm going to run through just some some of the ideas that I went through in this talk. So the first thing that you think about is like, how am I going to cut this idea down to the basics? So pachinko is a very simple concept. It's a metal ball that rolls and hits metal pins. So kind of the first iteration when you get here is, hey, shape doesn't matter. Add a little placeholders here for icons, and the mechanics are very simple. You drop balls, you get resources, and you end up doing battle. So first iteration here, I cut out everything that happens to do with pachinko machines. There's a lot of fluff in a pachinko machine. It's a lot of flashing lights, a lot of sounds, but needed to boil down to, hey, what is the kind of core here? And it's ball falling, hitting pegs. So that's where you start here, and then then you move on. Same mechanic, reuse the exact same layout. Use the exact same pegs here. Just switch the icons, and allowed to kind of iterate quickly through these kind of two machines here. So as you move forward, you start adding a little bit more. Most pachinko machines are circle, so I made sure to kind of include that classic pachinko shape. Added more pegs, as well as added some more features that made this a more roguelike game. So there are classes that your balls can be. There are different resources now, and so you can upgrade. You can upgrade your pegs here. So one of my pegs became occultist, which has different abilities as you go to the battle. And then you can also buy more pegs and replace them to collect different resources. I'll just do this real quick. So iterated on the battle as well, different enemy types. Some will now mess with your flow of your gameplay. And you can see the different pegs from the occultists have now slotted themselves in. And I also added some features to the balls, so they have ultimates, as well as XP at levels. This is kind of the next iteration of saying, hey, I took that basic machine, all it had was simple balls falling, had simple enemies. Now let's add a little more roguelike elements to it. You select your winnings, and then I added a slay the style map here, and then you kind of repeat it all over again. Then came the iteration. This is a game that I wasn't finding too much fun as I was going through it, so hit the iteration part pretty quickly. In this version, this is a kind of like endless wave version of the other ones. So mouse off, hands off. This is more of like an idle version of it. Enemies come in, you're not really touching anything. Took out some features. There's no more ultimates on the ball, I think, and kind of iterates through the battle. You're kind of protecting your kind of home there. And the very last iteration that I kind of ended up with is a little bit closer to kind of the original idea. Wave base wasn't fun. This one, you have your pegs, you add them in, you kind of level up yourself. And then it is a kind of one-on-one. You only shoot one ball at a time, and then instead of the pegs directly impacting the enemy, you kind of gather them all up into the item that it is, and then at the end of your run here, that's when the big effect happens. So in this version, I think was the most fun. It was closest to, I think, where I want this to be, but ultimately I didn't think this was worth the time at the moment. So moved on from here. But out of this, I got a lot of good tech. I was able to kind of pull out these managers that I built for these machines here to allow for quick iteration of, hey, I need a manager that architects the kind of flow of the game. So whether you're placing a peg, whether you're firing a ball, whether the enemy's going, I now have a pretty easy way to kind of drag and drop that into my next project to say, hey, I need a manager that manages kind of this time frame, this phases, what phase of this game is in. So at this point, I pulled out the tech that I needed to and said, hey, I'm going to shelve this for later. Could be a cool idea. I think something might be there, but wasn't really having fun with it. Didn't really find the niche at the moment. So I was like, hey, I'm going to shelve this and come back to this later. So that's kind of running through some examples of me using this talk in my own ideas here. So that's prototyping. You can find me at my website, patrickbryan.com. You can email me, contact@patrickbryan.com. If you have any questions or want to chat about prototyping, I'd love to see what you're working on. I'd love to give feedback. Just let me know. So, got a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. But now we can wrap up. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. That was great. When you have an idea you want to explore, and part of that idea might include something that is not trivial to prototype, how do you think about that? Because there's this budget of how much time do I want to spend prototyping, or do you say if I can't easily prototype it, then maybe not a good fit, or I'm curious how you weigh the pros and cons of considering.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot to weigh there of how integral is this to what you're trying to demonstrate, and then can you break that down even smaller? Because ideas, I think, can be boiled down to pretty small bite-sized bits, and it is all about time investment. So if that is the core feature of, hey, this is the idea, that's kind of what you need to spend your time on. But you should try to make it as simplified, as easy as possible for you to get through. And that might mean more cutting corners. It's not going to look pretty. The code's going to be pretty messy. The assets are going to be pretty wild. But whatever you can do to kind of cut that down to an even faster part is going to be beneficial for you to testing it. I think all good prototypes, you realize that, hey, I might scrap this whole thing and start over eventually. So with that in mind, you just got to cut as many corners as you can. Whether that's making sure that you isn't architect well. It's not scalable. It might be all hard coded values. But if it's integral, that's what you kind of have to work on. You have to kind of identify that, hey, this is the thing that makes my idea my idea. I would just try to make it as bite-sized as possible. It might just be one specific thing, and then if that's fun, you say, okay, now I'm going to take some time to expand it. But try to just make it as small as possible. Whether it's easy or not, that's kind of the goal there. Thank you so much.